Over the past year, Ukraine has found itself fighting on two fronts, with a military operation in the east of the country and an international campaign to try and counter what many have termed a massive Russian information campaign against Ukraine, as a key part of what many regard as a hybrid war launched by the Kremlin against Ukraine. We're joined today by Mark MacKinnon, who's the Senior Correspondent for Canada's Globe and Mail, based in London. Mark, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here. You've been covering Ukraine for many years. Obviously, for the past year, it's been particularly hot topic. Is it still top news, or would you say that it's struggling now to maintain the attention of global audiences?
It's a good question. In Canada, the interest is very high, perhaps because of the size of the diaspora there. When we don't pay attention to Ukraine, frankly, we get emails from our readers who ask why we're not paying attention, which is a good sort of discipline, I suppose. But it did slide down the agenda. I would say there was something like Ukraine fatigue happening in the international media towards the end of 2014, after everything that happened, and now you're starting to see a turn back, the focus returning to Ukraine with the Minsk talks and the war sort of kicking off again in the east. It has brought a lot of my colleagues back here this week, I've noticed.
Is it a matter of simply, for want of a better word, a body count? If people are dying, it's in the news. If it's just a matter of reforms in Ukraine and the country's future, it tends to slide down the agenda?
I wouldn't say it's body count, but there's a sense that something new is happening. If it's another day of shelling around Donetsk airport, as we saw for a long time, it's hard to tell your readers what's new that happened today. And when you can't come up with that bit, when you're just saying it's the same as yesterday, then yes, your editor starts to say maybe it's time to go look at some other part of the world. And there's a sense right now that, for whatever reason, we're seeing offensives on both sides as this peace process begins, and there's lots of talk that we are at some point of no return. I don't, all that has sort of captured the attention again.
Now, you've been covering Ukraine for over a decade, and obviously the last year has been a particularly intensive period. I think a lot of people who previously, a lot of journalists who didn't have experience of covering Ukraine particularly, or this part of the world in general, have come to the subject. How have you noticed coverage evolving over that period? Is it becoming more nuanced, more balanced? There's
a lot more people in the field these days than during the Orange Revolution. It was just, you had the sort of the standard, the Times, the Telegraph in London. You had the big American papers had a correspondence here, the Globe and Mail, the big television networks. Nowadays, you've got competitors like BuzzFeed and Mashable, who've done absolutely fantastic work, Vice News, who have changed the way we do our jobs and advanced, put pressure on all of us to pick up our game a little bit. At the same time, you do get people who don't know the backstory, they're coming into this, and they're reporting as though this struggle for Ukraine started yesterday, when in fact, for those of us who've been covering it for a while, you can go back to when I came here in 2002. We were talking then about Russian influence over the country and the struggle to influence the political system here. It's a very long game that some people, you have to have been here to see it. I mean, the people are coming in and just assuming that the clock starts at on February the 21st. Something happened, and here we are. Rather than to me, anyways, this does feel like this is something that's been going on since the 1990s in various forms.
I mean, how far back would you go? I mean, arguably you could go back to the First World War, or arguably you could go back to the Kiev Rus. I mean,
well, absolutely, but in a lot of the interviews I've done, people trace, there's a lot of conflict over the Second World War. That particular version of history, whose grandfathers were on which side of whose grandfathers were right in what they did back then. And if you go to Donetsk, for instance, that's certainly the narrative there. This is a conflict that began then. I'm not saying that's correct, but I'm saying there are different ways of looking at where this started. For me, I start with when I arrived, which is 2002, and that's the fact that I'm still talking with some of the same themes and interviewing some of the same people tells you that this is not something that began last February.
The theme of information war has been one of the headline subjects of the conflict. A lot of people have categorized that as a key part of what's been termed the hybrid warfare that a lot of people attribute to Russia, that it's essentially a new form of warfare, or perhaps a development on long-standing information practices in times of war. How successful do you think Russia has been in terms of being able to dominate or insert its narratives into the coverage of Ukraine?
It's an interesting question. I mean, they've certainly Russian news. I mean, I can remember doing interviews with people in Crimea and Odessa in the east, and their perspective has definitely been influenced by decades of watching news from Moscow. And so in that way, when I am quoting them, I'm picking up a narrative that's been passed on. But also when Western journalists, the rules are you quote everybody, you try and explain both sides. And so necessarily if something happens like the attack on Kramatorsk yesterday, there's the evidence that's before us, there's the OSCE remarks. We've also got sort of Russian media saying this was a false flag operation. We are bound to include that as a possible narrative in this. So yes, absolutely, it influences the coverage.
Now that particular issue, the idea of balance, the idea that in international media and certainly in Western media, that is, perhaps the golden rule, that there is two sides to every story and they must be presented. Has that been exposed by what we've seen over the last year? I mean, does that make Western media vulnerable to manipulation?
Yeah, and I think the important rule that people confuse neutrality with objectivity sometimes, and you can be neutral about something and balance everyone out the entire time, and that has obvious flaws. And I think at some point those who worked in South Africa in the 1980s had to stop giving fair play to those who were saying this apartheid system is a great idea. So objectivity, you have to be able to step back and stand away from that a little bit, and that's I think some of the more orthodox journalists struggle with that. They think they confuse the two terms.
I mean, what we see very often is a litany of accusations and charges put against Russia, followed by a disclaimer: Russia denies these charges. At what point does common sense kick in? Do we have to say, hold on a minute, there are some patterns emerging here? It's
well, something like MH17 is a wonderful example, where at the beginning there are all sorts of alternate theories, from Ukrainian fighter jets that attacked the plane to the plane had been ordered down. And in initial reports, yes, I mean, I was writing them from London where I was when it all happened, and you had to include the fact that the Kremlin was saying something because we didn't know any better. But as time and evidence is gathered, yes, you start to dismiss and play down these theories. It is sometimes the first drafts are what they are. They're the fog of war, shall we say. And over time, the arrival of Russian troops in Crimea was extremely frustrating when we were there at the start, and you could see these soldiers, and you could tell by their behavior and the way they were dressed, these were not some instantly created militia. But because they weren't wearing insignia, because you couldn't actually prove, you had to say these Russian-backed or pro-Russian troops, masked gunmen in Crimea. You couldn't just say Russian soldiers, even though Mr. Putin finally did say that later on. Now allows us to say what was evident to anyone who was there. We're seeing a little bit of the same in Donetsk right now, where it's we have to use these terms, Russian-backed, pro-Russian, because unless I'm holding their passport, and we've seen evidence, but unless I myself am 100% convinced, I have to include the qualifiers.
Well, this is the battle, the semantics, as it were, the battle of terminology. I think that's you raise the issue of Russian-backed, pro-Russian. When the conflict in East Ukraine began, we saw people talking about Ukrainian rebels or Ukrainian separatists, and I think that the pendulum has swung there to a certain extent. How much of a debate was that within your newsroom and amongst other correspondents who you communicate with in London, for example, from different publications, different news outlets?
Within my own newsroom, my editors, they trust my judgment on the ground on this, and to go back to Crimea for a second, there was a day where I was driving from Simferopol to Sevastopol, and my car was stopped at a checkpoint. And I saw a BTR, an armored personnel carrier that I'd worked in Chechnya previously, and I'm like, that's Russian military. And then, so I reported, there's Russian military setting up a checkpoint between Sevastopol and Simferopol. We had to roll that story back over time because other journalists went there, and the armored personnel carrier was then gone, and the soldiers were telling people, oh no, we're just locals. And so there was a lot of pressure on me, why are you the only one reporting there are Russian soldiers in Crimea? And looking back, we should just stuck to our guns a little bit.
There's a consensus, in other words.
Well, if you're on a limb on your own, you start to even question what you saw sometimes, because it is It is, you know, if the rest of the press pack is saying you got it wrong, there is that. I mean, the words like Russian-backed and pro-Russian, you know, I think it's important to say here, if you go into Donetsk, and I have gone several times in recent months, there are locals there who believe they believe they are fighting against, you know, this horrible government in Kyiv. Rightly or wrongly, that's what they believe. They are Ukrainian. So you can't just, as a journalist, I can't just say it's a Russian army offensive, because there are elements now, we know that some Russian columns have crossed, and yeah, so you come up with these terms like Russian-backed, because you are having to, you know, the waters are muddy. It's not me that's muddying them.
Well, it's not you that muddying them, certainly, which brings me to the issue of the Russian media itself, which is, I think, has taken I think it wouldn't be controversial to say has taken a hit in terms of its credibility over the last year. People here are quite used to the slant given to news by the Russian media, and also the extent to which Russian media is centrally controlled, either formally or informally, either direct ownership or indirect control via the Kremlin. But we saw a lot over the past year of Western media sources quoting and citing Russian outlets as credible sources of information. Do you think that attitudes towards Russian media have changed over the last year? You know, there's been a realization that actually these are not comparative to Western media outlets? Well,
I would say the Russian media has actually changed over the last year, and a very important and underreported event happened right before the Sochi Olympics last year, where the RIA Novosti news service, which when Dmitry Medvedev was president, was trying to establish itself. Obviously, it was still attached to the Russian state, but it was becoming a professional newswire akin to Agence France Presse, for instance, you know, which also has government funding. And then it got moved into this Rossiya Sevodnya, this larger body, and now it's gone. Now we've got Sputnik. And that is much more clearly a propaganda arm of the Russian government than RIA Novosti was. And a lot of my friends who were Russian journalists who worked for RIA Novosti, they left en masse. They quit. They said, this is not what we want to do. So the sources are changing. It's not just our perception of these sources that's changing. They are changing. They are becoming more active participants. And what they see, if you go to Moscow, they think there's a Western propaganda war against them, and they're just pushing back. But yeah, they've dispensed with the attempts to be neutral or objective, largely.
Do you think that's going to have a long-term impact on Russia, not just in the context of Ukraine, but in terms of the credibility of Russia as a partner nation in international affairs in general? And is it going to lead to a situation where almost anything that official Russian sources or Russian media say is going to be regarded as?
Well, you saw the reception to Sergei Lavrov at the Munich Security Conference. I mean, he was spouting a line that, you know, perhaps he even believes, I don't know. But the reception there was no one believed him anymore. And that is unfortunate, you know, from the perspective of someone who likes diplomacy and believes that we need to negotiate these things through. The fact that the diplomatic representative of the Russian Federation had so little credibility is dangerous, frankly, because it's going to increase this sense of, it tells you how high the hostility is on both sides. And the fact that he was willing to stay on point. I go back to Russia still several times a year. I used to live there 10 years ago, and I think the country has become more inward-looking and more nationalistic. And you know, people I've known for a long time have changed their views, and it's all very worrisome at that level.
There's been a lot of talk, especially amongst within the EU itself, but also internationally and from America and from Washington, about the need to counter the Russian information offensive over Ukraine and Russian information policies in general. I think this relates to internally within Russia and also internationally with Russia's attempts to influence the news narrative in Europe and throughout the world. Excuse me. Do you think there's a danger if the idea of propaganda and counter-propaganda, we could go down a road where all media becomes tainted, it becomes a lowest common denominator game where everyone gets dragged down and it becomes simply a battle of putting across rival points of view rather than covering news itself? Absolutely,
and also there's also a danger that we'll stop listening to each other. And as concerning as some of the messages from the Kremlin may be, I think to plug our ears to them also holds dangers. There are messages that you know, perhaps we should be picking up, and for better or for worse. I mean, we should be listening to what they're saying. They should be listening to what we're trying to say. On the big picture, I'm concerned by the fact that media organizations like my own, the Globe and Mail, have less resources for international news than we once did, and that gap is being filled by stations like RT. I used to live in China, by the rise of English language media based that's funded by the Chinese government. These messages, if you're sitting in a hotel room in but very specifically, I was in a hotel in Bangkok, and RT was just playing in the background in the gym, and I don't think the businessman jogging knew who was putting that message to them or what it was for. They just thought that was the news. So it's all, there's several levels of danger here, and I think we're not heading in a good direction.
I mean, in terms of listening to each other, doesn't that rely on the basic, the basic principle of goodwill that people are trying to put rather than simply looking to manipulate? I mean, the implication of the hybrid war concept is they're simply using. I've heard the term weaponizing information, weaponizing the news.
They are, but but I think it's important to, and here I am being that objective or neutral, boring guy, to realize that in Moscow there was always a perception that Western media was anti-Russian, and this RT was created, much like Ukraine today, to counter what they saw as a Western media offensive against them. And I think this all speaks to the lack of understanding, and that lack of understanding is obviously spilled over into some terrible things these days. None of this came from a vacuum, and going back to the creation of RT, I had friends who went to go work there because they thought they were just going to join an organization that was going to tell the news like anybody else did, and that they were going to thus, with a Russian perspective. But over time, most of them quit because they saw that this was not at all what they were engaged in.
Alongside this talk about countering Russia's information policies and attempts to influence the narrative is also suggestions of bans, of restrictions, of imposing certain limits and saying, okay, you broke this rule or that rule, or our sort of fair play rules of different media watchdogs in the Western countries. Where does the line lie between free speech and disinformation, and should we be looking to place limits, or should we be saying, have a free-for-all, say what you like, and let the public make the decisions themselves?
Well, again, I worry about the direction again. And for instance, last time I was in Moscow, I was meeting some sources who had connections to the Kremlin, and I jokingly, they said, "Oh, come back next time you come through," and I made a joke about, I hope I'll still get visas. And they replied, well, if Canada starts to apply, starts to kick out Russian journalists, we probably will reciprocate. And it probably sounds like a very good idea to some in various halls of power in the West. Each has RT, these are state propaganda organs. We shouldn't allow them to operate inside our country. The pushback could lead to us all sort of, losing our eyes and ears in Moscow as well, which would be, I think, extremely dangerous for the overall direction. If we don't understand Russia and they don't understand us, that's worrisome.
So an informational Iron Curtain, basically.
Yeah, we're drifting that direction where they're not listening. Inside Moscow nowadays, it used to be very easy to sort of access Western television stations or pick up a copy of the IHT, which they're much harder to find right now. They've disappeared. CNN's off the air in a lot of hotels that used to carry it, for instance. I don't think that's helpful to anyone. And if we start to say, like, turn off RT in the West, it's going to have that. They're big on reciprocity in Russia, so that would be unfortunate, I think.
Now, as someone who's covered Ukraine for many years, a lot of journalists are coming to Ukraine now for the first time, even seasoned journalists who are perhaps not experienced in this part of the world, who are now being told by their editors and newsrooms, okay, you've got to go out there. And they're approaching these issues for the first time, just trying to get a handle on them. What would be your top tips for people coming into the environment now as basically Ukraine novices?
Yeah, and I think you have to go to these places yourself to understand them. Maybe you can't rely on the channels of information like we're discussing the dangers of misinformation. The only way to counter that is boots on the ground, media boots on the ground, journalists who go and see what happened yesterday in Mariupol, go to Donetsk and try and understand sort of what this thing is and where it might be headed. But also take the long view. I mean, understand that this is not a year-old conflict. This is a very long one that is just boiled over.
Okay, well, Mark, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. This has been Peter Dickinson in the Ukraine Today newsroom with Mark MacKinnon from the Globe and Mail from Canada. Back to the news.